I'm John Wilker, the organizer of 360 IDEP. I hope you enjoy this session recording, but first I wanted to mention one thing. We've served the community since 2009, and over the past few years we've had to take on debt in an effort to keep the conference alive. After several unforeseen challenges, not the least of which is a pandemic of indefinite duration, we've had to make the hard choice to end the conference as we're now facing over $100,000 in debt. As a result of requests from the community of how they can help, we've created a GoFundMe campaign. If you're inclined and able, please consider donating to help keep 360 IDEP going. The QR code after this will link you to the campaign. Thank you. Enjoy the recording.
That was just my boisterous voice carrying me. In putting together this presentation, I was plagued all night with the Korn song from TikTok. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that at all, but it's been constantly playing through my head. So if I just like randomly blurt out, "It's Korn," that's what's going on there. Thank you for coming. First, I don't know if they'll be able to hear us, but can we hear it real quick for John and Nicole and the other speakers, volunteers? It's been awesome being back in person. Definitely wouldn't be possible without any of them. So the dark side of diversity and inclusion. I'm sure one of the first questions on your mind would be, what does this cis, white, straight man have to do talking about diversity and inclusion? It would be a fair question, but give me just a moment to introduce myself. My name is Nick Laughter, and I am actually autistic. I have very severe autism. I've learned really great masking skills. This hashtag, by the way, is fantastic. If you go on Twitter and search for it, you'll see thousands of really incredible stories from people that mostly all include the phrase, "You don't look autistic." It's a common curse for us. But it's true. I've spent my whole life feeling like I'm missing things, that people must be having secret conversations behind closed doors to give each other context that I just wasn't a part of. And eventually got a diagnosis and everything helps out. But this comes out in every facet of my existence, in particular, working with neurotypical people. It feels incredibly empowering, strangely, to realize that you're not the only person that has felt alone in the workplace. So to that end, for anybody that has ever felt alone in your work, I can empathize. I actually gave a presentation at IDEV 2020 titled Advocating for Neurodiverse Inclusive Policies. The link will be in my slide deck if anybody's interested in checking that out. But let's go ahead and move forward. When I was putting together my concept for this topic, it became very quickly apparent the breadth of this issue. When you even just think about the diverse groups that we have, you've got culture, you've got racial, religious, age, sex and gender, sexual orientation, disability. Even within disability, you have physical disabilities, such as also cognitive, such as my own. There are so many humans encapsulated by this list. And inclusion is really nothing more than just saying who you are matters and creating a space for you to just be yourself as an individual. Who is this presentation for? It's not for leaders, per se. When I was putting my concept together for this presentation, one of the constant nagging thoughts that I had was, this would be great if I could stand in front of your C-level leadership and give this presentation, but that's not going to be primarily who will be here for it. The vast majority of you, maybe some of you might be managers or VPs, but pretty much everybody that is going to be exposed to this presentation is going to be fairly just employee level. So I wanted to specifically cater this presentation to be something that everybody can take and have an actionable challenge that you can move forward with. So, for that being said, thank you for being here. I do believe that together we can positively affect change and radically improve our entire world. So, let's begin. The dark side of diversity and inclusion. I couldn't possibly be inspired by a massive Star Wars nerd. But this concept sort of came to me because I feel like a lot of times we tend to want to butter up and sugarcoat the concept of diversity and inclusion. We want it to just be a positive experience for everybody because it is such an important thing, which we'll get into in a moment. But I do believe there are 3 steps to forming a holistic view of diversity and inclusion. First, of course, is to understand why. There's no point in even having a conversation if we can't all get on the same page about why this is worth our time to begin with. Second is, what's the problem? What are the roadblocks? What are the issues that we're running into that make this a presentation that's even worth having to begin with? And finally, what can we do? So, digging in, why diversity and inclusion? We're gonna need a bigger boat. Stephen Covey, brilliant business leader, understood that strength lies in our differences, not in our similarities. I mean, could you imagine watching any sport where everybody on the team worked the same way? They all played the same. Imagine football, if everybody was a quarterback or tackle, it wouldn't work. Similarly, with the way that our minds function, if everybody has the same kind of background, they look the same, they have the same or similar life experiences, you're just not going to be very effective as a whole team. And by investing into diversity, your organization will be able to see things from different angles and solve problems in ways that you haven't been able to in the past. Research has shown that companies that are diverse, by whatever definitions that this reference used to determine that, they outperform competitors by 35%. Now, just quick show of hands, who works for a company that needs money? Oh, all of you. That's amazing. Okay, well, yeah, this seems like a pretty good justification then. You probably all have competitors in whatever space you're in. You want to be better than them. This is a good way to do it, okay? Josh Bersin, fantastic HR guru, HR strategist. I highly recommend you check him out. He has done tons of studies on diversity and inclusion, and he's identified that it's not just this HR program. You know, people would get pressure from outside sources and on the board meeting say, you know, we really should hire more black people. Like, yeah, but it's more than that. It's literally a business strategy now. If you're having problems in your business, technologically, with your sales, customer service, whatever it is, diversity, just bringing on more diverse candidates has shown to have a direct correlation in your ability to solve those problems better. And the list goes on. I'm obviously not going to read every single one of these, but it is abundantly clear that investing in diversity and inclusion is just good for your business. If your business is struggling, bring on different thinkers. You probably have problems where you are because of the people that have already been there. So bring in different types of people, they'll bring different types of solutions. You cannot measure certain things though. This list, this is great. You know, as your company begins to move forward in some of these initiatives, yeah, they'll start to identify, yeah, our team performance is X amount better, or we have, you know, Y percentage higher chance for new markets, right? Those things are great, and they're measurable, and they drive your board to make decisions like that. You can't measure things like doing the right thing, or spreading love, or allowing people to feel empowered and seen and valued. Those are the real reason why we invest in diversity and inclusion, but they're not measurable. They're not things that you can take to your CEO and say, look at how much love we're not spreading, right? And so this is your way to kind of take this very important concept that you wouldn't be in here or watching this later if you didn't feel like there was some value to this topic already. These are things that you can take to business leadership, your manager or whoever, and you can say, these are things that kind of await for us if we take this more seriously. But, you know, deep down in your mind, you can be like, but also, you know, being good people is a good benefit of that. Which leads to, what's the problem? Right? I mean, if you ask pretty much any person in general, do you think it's good to have a diverse pool of candidates for hiring or diverse employees? In general, people will say, yeah, sure, you've got the exception to that. But pretty much everybody will say, sure. So what's the problem? Everybody, I'm sure, is somewhat familiar with the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? And that's ultimately what we have with diversity and inclusion. There are so many steps that companies can take that most of them think they are doing. First off, this comes out in the culture fit. Probably every one of you has heard at some point that you want to make sure you test your candidates for culture fit. It's kind of a misled notion, obviously, because people that fit your culture are already going to be just like you. You want to hire people that don't necessarily fit your culture. Obviously, you want them to have a sense of morality. You don't want to hire people that tell you in the interview process that they're going to steal your IP and go give it to your competitor, right? That's a pretty low bar. But in general, the concept of the culture fit is already very resistant to diversity. Next is the tick box mentality. I'll get into that in a moment, but basically it's what causes our business decisions to be made. And finally, prioritization. So first, let's take a look at culture fit. It just by itself, the concept of wanting to hire for a culture fit, it discourages diversity in the first place. I don't think it's too controversial to say that everybody has an unconscious bias, right? Even people that think they're the most unbiased people in the world usually turn out to be the most biased. And even if you're putting in a lot of the work to internally to fix a lot of those unconscious biases, you could still pass somebody on the street that looks like that one TikToker you just can't stand, and then all of a sudden you have an unconscious bias against that person. They come up in everyday life. Everybody has it, right? But when you hire for culture fit, you're basically telling your interviewers to confirm their own unconscious biases, because you're telling them basically hire depending on how good they make you feel to be in the same room with them or be on the same call as them, what kind of stuff you get to talk about. Obviously, you don't want to hire somebody that you can't pass at the water cooler and talk about the sports that you watched on the weekend or whatever, right? That's the mentality. Next is the tribal mentality. This is kind of built into that as well. This concept that, we as a species sort of evolved the need to be around people that looked like us, talked like us, thought like us, acted like us, behaved like us, solved problems like us. That was what got us safely into building communities. Now, all it does is it hurts all of us, some more than others. But the tribal mentality, tribal thinking is so pervasive. I mean, every single one of you, I guarantee, has been in an interview where you just didn't feel like you were in. Things felt off. There was kind of a rift. This tribal mentality, again, kind of coming off the unconscious bias of, like, I don't know how well they'd fit, and we just didn't really have anything to talk about. That really shouldn't matter if your performance is going to be based on your ability to do the job, not your ability to BS at the water cooler. Next, actual racism and sexism and ableism and bigotry and other forms. This does exist. It's everywhere. I have one of my very best friends in Utah works for a massive manufacturing company. I won't say who. Obviously, I don't want to risk getting back to her, but she tells me about some of these stories of inner office affairs where they brag about it. There are women in leadership that higher up leadership behind their backs and to their faces refers to them as the girls. Anytime any of the women in leadership want to make a decision, they just say, oh, the girls are at it again. And it kind of leads to this sort of good old boys type of situation where if you're not part of the core of what represents the culture that they've already built, you really don't belong. And yeah, they may hire women just to meet certain requirements or quotas. They may hire other minorities, but they really don't create a culture where they belong. They're just there so that the company doesn't get in trouble. Okay? And that comes from a tick box mentality. Now, this is problematic because it's a difficult solution to fix. How do you go to business leaders that have spent their entire careers identifying certain metrics and getting them to pass and having that lead to financial benefit and telling them your metrics are just simply ineffective, right? This usually looks like with companies. We have X percentage Black employees, Y percentage Hispanic employees, Z percentage female employees, right? And they look at it as just, it's like a vaccine. Like you just get it done and then you're good. You don't have to worry about it. Like, yeah, you might have some issues, but you're pretty much done. This is obviously a problem because accountability comes into play where one of two things is going to happen. Either one, they check off the box. They're like, cool, we're diverse now. Problem solved. We don't even have to worry about it anymore. And then any attempts to go to them and say, hey, we're not actually fixing these problems, we're not an inclusive culture, then they just don't want to hear it. Or they don't tick the box, and then the leadership looks at it and says, maybe that was just too lofty of a goal. You know, we couldn't possibly be the problem. The problem was the mentality that, you know, we needed that many people, so we'll just change. And the accountability kind of stops with them, but also because of that, business leaders tend to be resistant to any kind of outside feedback on those matters. And that leads to this philosophy of, we've done enough. We've done what we can. We've done what's within our purview, right? We can't make more diverse candidates come and apply, right? So the issue obviously here is that by having this tick box mentality, the business leaders tend to give themselves a scapegoat of not needing to continue carry this through, which leads to an issue with prioritization. Financial goals for the company will always trump culture goals. That's just the reality of the situation, which I know it sucks, but every business leader is responsible to somebody, whether it's their own board or themselves. If it's a small company, whatever it is, everybody's accountable to somebody and everybody has their goals for the company. The problem is that these two should not be seen as mutually exclusive or something that you choose one over the other. Like we just saw in the previous point about why diversity and inclusion, by investing into culture goals, the company is going to be better able to meet their financial goals. But because there's a disconnect there, it's difficult for companies to buy in. That often leads to immediate gratification policymaking. One example of this was I had Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, which, if you don't know what that is, it's essentially shingles outbreak inside of one of your facial nerves. It had a lot of horrible effects, but one of which was that I had no ability to balance for several months. I was in a wheelchair. My legs worked great, but if I stood up, I had to hold on to something. It was like my whole world was just constantly spinning. It was awful. So I had to be in a wheelchair. At the time, I worked for a company called Vivint, and I worked for tech support for them. And when this happened, I was ready to get back into work, and I said, hey, so I'm in this wheelchair now. You guys only have stairs. Like, what are we gonna do about this? And effectively, they just made a quick adjustment to a policy where I was able to get in through the back into the shipping warehouse portion of the building. I was able to take the freight elevator up a level to the storage area, all without a hard hat, which probably should have had, but took up to the storage area and then had to wheel myself around to the rest of where the normal people were. All together, it was about a quarter mile of trekking with a wheelchair, some slopes. It was awful. But my pressure for the company was, hey, like, I'm stuck in this wheelchair. I can't do anything about this. And what they should have done was invested the money to build a ramp or an elevator in the front of the building or anything like that. And they didn't. It was just instant gratification. It was like, well, we're just going to get this taken care of real quick because we don't want to make too big of a deal about it. Fortunately, I wasn't in the wheelchair very long, but even more fortunately, I wasn't with the company very long either. One of the problems that we run into is that the company sees short-term lip service trumping long-term inclusive policies. What do I mean by that? We had our Pride Month not too long ago, right? How many companies did you see change their logo banner to an inclusivity flag or just a rainbow or something like that, and then at the end of the month they change it back and there's nothing left? There's nothing on their blogs. They don't have any kind of transparency, right? Corporations tend not to really care. It's kind of a marketing scheme at this point, which as an autistic person is difficult. Autistic people are compulsive problem solvers, okay? So we see things like that, and it makes our brains want to implode because we see the problems and we see the solution. Why is nothing happening? Why are we not doing this? Which leads to the next point that I'll get into in just a moment. Jenna Stovall, which if you don't know, brilliant woman. She has a TED Talk about inclusivity, specifically with African Americans. She says it's a numbers game, that inclusion is about impact. You can mandate your diversity, you can mandate how many of X number of employee you have to hire, but you have to cultivate an inclusion. And my takeaway from this is that you cannot cultivate inclusion when your employees feel unsafe, unseen, and undervalued. But these are policies that the company has to invest into for the purpose of that, just believing that the benefit will be there for them. And again, back to Josh Bersin, 70% of companies believe they're advanced in these efforts. This isn't just, your small company leadership saying, yeah, we probably should hire a BIPOC somebody, right? This is like companies that believe that they are leaders in this area, but just over 10% actually understand what it takes to make an impact. Statistically speaking, even if your company takes pride in their diversity and inclusion efforts, they're not doing enough. And this, I believe, is what gives us the dark side of diversity and inclusion. The problem, unsurprisingly, is people. We're hard to change. We're stuck in our patterns. It's so easy to say, we've just done this for so long. Come to the dark side. Release your anger. And it's tempting to do, because if that's what's working for them, and if the company, worst case scenario, actually gives benefits or props to people that do already support them in those efforts, it's just a self-perpetuating issue. So to summarize, what's our problem? Number one, culture fit. We have this misled perception that the way that somebody fits in actually matters. Number two, tick box mentality. We just say, okay, well, these, just to get people off our back, these are the metrics that we'll go by, and when we do it, we're done. Finally, prioritization. It just simply doesn't matter as much as other things. So what can we do? This seems awful drab, right? It's pretty sad. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this is for everybody. This is not just for business leaders or managers. This is something that everybody, as base level employees, you can do to take to your company to start positively impacting these initiatives. Okay? Even if you're no manager, executive, anything like that, you can make a huge difference in your workplace and just in the world. But it does take a little bit of time. Okay? First and foremost, and this is the hard one. Okay, you ready? Learn respectful discourse. This is a challenge, admittedly. I mean, I'm sure I'm probably not, I don't know, maybe I'm the only person in here that's ever told somebody to F off just because they wouldn't understand what I was saying. No? Okay, just making sure. It's a problem because, again, we succumb to tribal mindset as well. So when we're trying to argue with somebody and it's so obvious, the answer is so clear, and they just don't buy in, it's frustrating for us. And it's so easy to disrespect or discount the person, the human, while we're having these conversations. The irony, of course, being we're trying to have conversations about why we should be respecting and honoring people, and our response to them not buying into it is often to dishonor and disrespect the person that we're having it with. Next is to get involved at work. And we'll get into some key areas that you can do that in just a moment. And then finally, advocate for others. You don't have to be the minority group that you want to advocate for. There's no reason why you have to be in all of that to take effective action. So starting off, learn respectful discourse. I'm gonna give you a little bit of history about myself. I used to be what I would categorize as a very angry, staunch conservative. Not at all to imply all conservatives are that way, but I certainly was. I just felt like they're coming for the guns. I gotta worry about the gay agenda. Like I didn't get it. That was just kind of how I was raised, and I apologize for that. Again, nothing politically against conservative people. That was just, I was very angry at the world and anybody that wanted to change the way that I was raised. It led to a lot of defensiveness in my life. Anytime anybody would come and challenge something that I was saying or thinking, they just didn't get it. They were just wrong. They were stupid. Me and my guns were going to go be, elevated in our mindset over there, and they, the libs could just go and do their own thing. And that was just my MO. Well, as I began getting into technology, I had worked in tech most of my life, specifically as I started getting into engineering. I met a lot of people. Engineering, admittedly, a fairly left-leaning field. I joined the Utah iOS Mac Developer Group and started getting into conversations with people. Eventually, we made a pound change my political mind, which to this day I regret having any kind of encouragement about starting that channel. However, take the good with the bad. It was instrumental in leading me to having an evolution in my perspective on things. And it didn't come overnight. It wasn't just one conversation. This was hours and hours and hours over several years of conversations with people. And the one person in this group that I attribute most to representing this concept of respectful discourse is man we all know and love, very own Dave DeLong. Dave, I wouldn't even begin to count the number of F words we've thrown at each other over the years. But the thing that ultimately helped me to realize what's going on is that all the conversations we had, all of the back and forth, you don't understand, no, you don't understand, all the political articles we've shared, the one constant that he represented for me was to realize that when I was arguing, it was because I wanted to be right. I wanted to change someone's mind because I wanted to confirm what I already thought. And through all these conversations with Dave and others, I learned that he was arguing on behalf of other people. He was arguing, and they were arguing because they just simply wanted other people to be represented and understood and valued and accepted. And again, it took several years, but eventually my defensiveness shifted. Dave, through all of this and others, showed me the empathy that I lacked, helped me over time to develop an ability to realize, you know what, I am being so selfish in my mindset. I really am only thinking about myself. Ultimately, he and others helped me to learn it does not matter when you're right if others are still suffering as a result of it. Yeah. So, learn respectful discourse. It's the number one tool that you have to begin to affect things. But as I said in the beginning of this section, it takes time. Years in my case. Next is to get involved at work. Never underestimate the value of pressuring your boss. Now, don't think of your boss as an enemy. They're there to help you and to help the company to lead. They're always in a very high tension situation. But there are several things that you can do and ask your boss that may help them to begin seeing that this is something that deserves some movement, some momentum. First of all, never assume these questions I'm about to show you have already been asked, and never assume any of these things are already in place. So first, what are we doing as a company to empower diverse candidates and employees? It's a very simple question, but it has profound impacts because the way that your manager, supervisor, business leader, however, answers this question will tell you not just what the company is doing based on metrics, but culturally how they are hoping to positively impact the lives of diverse groups. Next, who can I talk to about volunteering as an advocate for diverse employees? Again, incredibly powerful question because, as I mentioned, you don't have to be the diverse employee that you want to see better represented in your workplace. And there are things that they may be able to offer you as ways that you can further promote this. Where are our company's resources for diverse employees listed? This one is huge. My current company is fantastic with this. They're like right in onboarding HR. One of the first things they tell you about is all of the ERGs, the employee resource groups that we already have available. It's all widely there. If you are interested in them, you can just jump straight in. There's weekly meetings for everybody. It's fantastic. I highly recommend, if you don't already have diverse employee resources somewhere, you can put together your own list. And this comes in with advocating for others. Advocacy is an activity that you take. You don't just advocate by saying you are an advocate. You show that you are an advocate by your actions. And here are several actions that you can take as an advocate for diversity and inclusion. Number one, be outspoken. Give presentations on this crap. This is good stuff. I mean, like, not necessarily mine in particular, but the topic is good stuff. You can have a meeting with your business leadership. You can just start having a weekly conversation. Here's an idea. Throw a meeting on your calendar and invite several people, whether they're in a diverse group or not, and have the topic of the meeting be diversity in our workplace. Simple enough. People will start going to that. And you'd be amazed how quickly that will build your momentum. Next, start an employee resource group. If you don't already have one, get one going. As I was putting this together, I realized I need to take my own advice because the company I work has several resource groups. We do not currently have one for neurodiversity. So as I put that together, I was like, okay, well, I mean, I guess no better way to realize my own weaknesses than to give a presentation on the thing that I feel like we're weak about. So my plan after the conference is I'm going to go to my HR department and ask about starting an ERG. And if I don't have their backing, I'll just start my own. Simple enough. Be ready for resistance. Okay, as we talked about, businesses are structured such that every action has a measurable output. And if that measurable output does not align with the company's financial goals, they are not going to see it as a valuable action to take. And so when you start doing these things, it takes time, sometimes years, sometimes decades, depending on the size of the organization. And you're going to have people that will say, it's not worth it. Like, what you're doing, it's causing rifts, you know, it's uncomfortable, it's causing friction, people don't like it, and you're having really, you know, controversial conversations, and it's really not benefiting anybody. And the thing to keep in mind with this is that it is. Even if it's not employees that are there yet, even if it's employees that won't be there for years to come, even if it's non-employees, just simply candidates in the hiring process, you'll never know what somebody will take in a conversation that you had, even if it seemed like they wanted nothing to do with it, that will stick with them and positively impact the diverse groups that they run into for the remainder of their lives. Finally, you can track metrics yourself. Obviously, your HR department is not going to tell you this is how many diverse employees we have. Maybe they will. If they have a lot of transparency, that's great. I've worked for companies that are very transparent about their diversity metrics, and I think that's fantastic. But you can also track this stuff for yourself so that you have something when those meetings present themselves. The CEO marches down and says, hey, why are you having these conversations about how we don't have enough ethnicity in our workplace? You can say, how many BIPOC people do we pass in the hallway? You know, how many people in wheelchairs do we have working here? You can break down all of these groups and say, I don't see anybody over the age of 40 in our workplace. What's going on? And you can turn it back around on your business leader and just say, hey, I'm just going by what I'm observing here. I'm not trying to attack the company. I'm not trying to attack you, but this is an important thing. If you don't think so, I'd love to talk to you about the benefits that might await our company when we do this. Back to Janet Stovall. 30% is the number that a minority group will have their voices heard within the company. The reason this is problematic is because a lot of business leaders will look at that and say, okay, so we need to have 30% black employees, 30% disabled employees, 30%, right? That's not how the math works. The difference is 30% represents the percentage of the company that has to be speaking for the minority group, right? As an autistic person, I'm probably the only person within my smaller organization that I work within that has cognitive disability, right? But if I have 5 or 6 of my coworkers willing to go to other business leaders and say, hey, you know, we have an autistic person that's like struggling with this thing, this might be helpful for them. Then you start getting traction. When it's just me, then it's just, oh, it's just the squeaky wheel squeaking again. I guess just apply more grease. And that's what leads to these short-term solutions. Finally, all of this gets wrapped up. Become an ally. Just be an ally. Look for people in your organization, LGBTQ+, BIPOC, any kind of diverse group that you don't see represented well. Go to them and just say, hey, I've just noticed we don't have a lot in our company by way of diversity and inclusion. How can I be a better ally for you in this regard? Usually they'll probably just say, hey, just bringing this up is great. But there might be real ways that the people that you work with can benefit from your allyship that if you don't just ask, you may not know. So to wrap up, what can we do? How can we positively affect diversity and inclusion? If all else fails, we go on strike. I'm kidding. Kind of. Am I? I don't know. That's for you to decide. So, number one, learn respectful discourse. Just learn to talk to people. People are not going to agree with you. They're not going to see the value of the things you see value in. Learn how to engage with them in a way that is not completely dismissive. Unless, at some point they show you they're just unwilling to take on anything or any kind of understanding, at which point it's probably justified. Get involved at work. Talk to your boss and advocate for others. By doing all of these things, we together can bring a new hope to people who otherwise, historically, just simply did not belong in corporate settings, in the workplace. So, to wrap up, why diversity and inclusion? Because it matters. And even if that's not enough, it will benefit your company. What's the problem? Well, people is the problem. But people are also the solution. You can be the change that you want to see in your workplace. You can start that. You don't have to wait for your HR to do it. If anybody has never read Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, I cannot recommend this book enough. It is one of my top leadership books I've ever read. But Ed talks about, at one point in the Pixar history, they had this very long table in their meeting room where they would discuss their story ideas and other business topics. And he didn't quite realize over time that this was causing rifts in their organization. They were not being very effective. And this table, he later identified, was the cause of these problems. Because all the important people sat in the middle, and the further out you went, the less important you were. And because people were literally marginalized, like physically marginalized with this table. The less important people sat at the ends, and if they had something to say, they had to try to chime in. They were never heard by the other end of the table. And even in the middle, people had to kind of crank their neck to be able to even make eye contact with them. Well, it so happened that one day, that room, I think it was under construction or something, so they had to meet in a separate room with a square table. And Ed immediately recognized, I can hear everybody. I can see everybody. Everybody has an equal voice. They can all speak and be recognized. And that day, he went down and had the services department remove their long table. The moral of the story is, it's not enough just to have a foot in the door. It's not enough just to have a seat at the table. We want to feel seen at the table, even if we're not the ones actually sitting there. Having somebody that is capable of speaking for us that does have an equal view at the table, be it with leadership, culture, what have you, is all that we want. We want to be seen, heard, and valued in the same way as everybody else. So that wraps up our perspective on the dark side of diversity and inclusion. And for anybody that remembers my Cohen joke earlier, I can't imagine a more beautiful thing. Again, my name is Nick Laughter. You can find me on the Twitters or LinkedIn. I don't really use either too awfully much, but you can get a hold of me there. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah. Okay, so essentially what you're asking is, like kind of how do you combat like if somebody's hired as a diversity hire, how do you kind of combat that, like being discounted, not being quite qualified? It's a fantastic question. So my personal approach is to have better training within the organization. If somebody's brought on as a diversity hire, first of all, that's problematic for the organization to begin with, because if the organization already thinks there's something off about a person being hired that is a minority group, like that speaks to a much larger cultural issue within the company. Like it should not be weird to just hire cultural people. Secondly, I feel like that is probably something that will just get better with time. If the company is taking those initiatives to be more diverse in their hiring practices, as more and more diverse hires come through the door, it will just become the way that the company operates. It won't be that noteworthy. As far as, you mean like kind of culturally, like internally, how people talk about that? I think the big thing is just to be transparent about those conversations. Especially if you're in management, having the ability to say, hey, like, some people have voiced this concern. It's kind of concerning, first of all, that people would even have that perspective to begin with. But secondly, it's like if you're gonna raise that kind of a concern, what are you doing about it to help them? Like, what are you doing about it to make sure that they are more capable and more trained, right? That's fine. But you said you had an answer to that question as well. Oh, just training. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right. Like we can all learn engineering, right? It's not like engineering is not that hard to do. It's some parts of it are very difficult, but anybody can learn. Especially if you have people that know how all your services work, they know how your app works, and you bring in somebody new, you're going to have some knowledge transfer anyway. So it seems like if anybody's bringing up the diversity hire thing, it just seems like an excuse to be a crappy person. Yeah. Is anybody else? Yeah. So I'm sorry, I can't hear too well here. So it sounds like you're asking, like, how do you stop yourself kind of from getting like exhausted from like working specifically in like the D&I efforts, or like what's the context here? Honestly, it's just one of those things that ideally it's a group effort, right? It's not something that you're taking on yourself. And so, I try to be as outspoken as I can, be as effective as I can be. But there are times, obviously, I get overwhelmed. I have a lot of work that I have to take care of. And ideally, you'll be in a situation where you can just pass off to somebody else and just say, hey, like, I'm not going to be able to run like our ERG this week. You just take it over, whatever. Because it needs to be a group thing. It needs to be a company initiative. Again, 30% is what it takes. 30% of your organization has to represent the voices of minorities in order for them to be heard, right? And so the point isn't necessarily to say, here are the problems and here are my steps that I'm going to solve them. The point is to say, here are the problems, who can I involve in solving them? And together, we can work to solve them together. And when you need to take a step back, mental health is a huge aspect that's impacted by diversity and inclusion as well. You get burned out. It feels hopeless sometimes. And so having the ability to step back and just say, you know what, like I need to take a break and have other people that you have included in this to beginning to kind of help take the lead. Sometimes it might help because, again, the point is diversity, right? And so if you're kind of taking the lead and spearheading everything and doing everything, there might be solutions that you're not seeing that by kind of passing the mantle off to somebody else for a time might be able to be solved. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else? Alrighty. Thank you very much.